March Madness is here and the round of 64 begins today. To celebrate, the next Adler is here to chat all about the bracket as a whole, predictions, teams and individual players we're excited to watch, and more. Locked On Women's Basketball starts now.
Ogunbowale for the win.
Good! You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Hello and happy Friday. You are locked on to women's basketball. I'm Natalie Heavren, and I'm a features writer and the Atlantic 10 beat reporter for The Next. Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase Locked On NBA for a first deposit match up to $100. If this is your first time listening to Locked On Women's Basketball, welcome, perfect timing. And we at The Next have over 100 reported pieces every single month. We have a beat reporter on every single WNBA team, one on more than 15 different NCAA beats, so get that YouTube subscription up. And you can also support us by subscribing to The Next, $9 a month, $72 a year at thenexthoops.com. Today, we'll be talking all about the 2024 NCAA Tournament bracket, teams and individuals we're excited to watch, and we'll make some predictions that could very well sound silly by the end of the weekend. Joining me today is the Adler, who covers the WNBA and college basketball, focusing on player development and the game behind the game for us over at The Next. And before we get started, I just have to plug Monday's episode of Locked On Women's Basketball, where Missy Heidrich broke down each quadrant of the bracket. So make sure to go listen to that. And then come back over here and listen to us. And I just want to start off by talking about Elizabeth Kitley of Virginia Tech, who won't be playing in the NCAA tournament. That news recently came out. And how does it impact Virginia Tech and their potential or ceiling in the tournament?
Unfortunately, I think this is just clearly it for Virginia Tech. Not saying that they're not going to get a win, but I think anyone who was really diligently watching conference tournaments the last couple of weeks saw what Virginia Tech looked like without Kitley. It's unfortunately not going to look like when Georgia Amore hit like 8 threes after Kitley got injured against UVA to close the regular season. It's probably going to look a lot more like the team that really struggled to get to 50 points in multiple games. It is, if Amore hits a bunch of threes, the team's going to play well and score. If Amore does not hit a bunch of threes, they're probably going to lose pretty quickly. The only issue I think in terms of sort of the bracketness of it, I think the committee clearly was baking in the severity of how the injury seemed and the fact that they didn't get any real updates from that. We'll get into that in a little bit, given the larger trend there. But with Virginia Tech already being seated at the 4 line, with them having to deal with Baylor, with them, if you beat Baylor, you have to deal with USC. It was not a pretty matchup to begin with, and this, I think, just sort of is a really unfortunate way to go out, especially given the news that we also know this morning about Kenny Brooks. It is a very unfortunate way to end that run of this era for the Hokies.
Yeah, and before we dive into some of the nitty-gritty, was there anything about the bracket as a whole that surprised you?
Right. I think the main thing for me was just how much credence the selection committee gave to injury exceptions. So, Virginia Tech being at the 4 line was sort of one of those. If Liz Kitley is perfectly healthy, there's no way that they are lower than a 3 seed. I think we saw this in other different places across the bracket as well. UCLA on the 2 line is very much related to, taking out how they perform without Betts. Texas A&M probably doesn't make the tournament at all if they don't look pretty dang good once Andia Rogers comes back after missing, maybe half a dozen games. If they don't look good after her coming back in the SEC tournament. And, I think I support this as far as a general strategy from the committee because it lends itself to much better matchups. You drop UCLA from the 2 line and things get a little more funky. Do we have to litigate LSU's non-conference schedule? Do we have to figure out those matchups there? It sets itself up pretty well. if A&M's out, who are we replacing them with, like Mississippi State? I think in these kind of cases, they mostly got these things right, and it sets itself up pretty well, is how I put it.
And you were at the Ivy League tournament. Were you surprised by a 2-bit Ivy? It's something we've only seen, I believe, one time previously.
I'm not surprised in terms of the quality of the teams. If you've been watching these teams all season long, after a couple rough weeks to open the season, Columbia really got things into gear, as the committee specifically said after they did the whole selection. The thing with Columbia is that I think coming into that tournament title game with Princeton, they had won, it was something like 21 of their last 22. And, it's not like beating up on, Brown and Yale aren't necessarily the highest caliber opponents, but it really did speak to the quality of the team and the quality of the competition. And especially, I think when you have someone like Abby Shue leading the team, it just lends itself to a team that's going to look really good in the tournament. I think we were all pretty excited to see them included in over, in the words of Meg Griffith, a 15-win, 17-win SEC team. And in that sense, I think it was really nice to be able to see them in the tournament. They did lose, but just being able to see that opportunity, being able to, for a program like that, have that level of breakthrough and be able to really cash in on that, it's just really, really fun to see. And it adds to a level of, what we get out of the tournament that I don't think you would have if you would have included, again, to go back to Meg Griffith, that 15-win, 17-win SEC team instead.
Yeah, it was definitely really fun to watch Abby Shue play in an NCAA tournament game. It was Columbia's, I believe, first ever NCAA tournament berth. So just, that magic in March that, a lot of us were hoping to see a 2-bit Ivy just based on, Columbia's resume, but we weren't sure if we're going to see it. So I agree. It definitely was really fun to see. And we'll be seeing Vanderbilt instead in the next round. But Vanderbilt was also a great team to watch. And Shea Ralph, UConn legend, as they mentioned on the broadcast repeatedly, excited to see her in her own right, continuing her coaching into March.
Speaking of continuing coaching, Natalie, I think we have some news to break that just broke live.
Yes.
Did you see the Slack?
I did.
So speaking of teams that I think could have made the tournament over Columbia, that we probably would have been sad about, Katie Meyer just retired as the head of Miami, as the head of the Miami Hurricanes. I don't really have any reactions to that. We're talking about the NCAA tournament. That is just incredibly funny, given that we got the Kenny Brooks news about Kentucky right before we started the podcast.
Yeah, I think my quote was something along the lines of "Hope nothing else breaks." So
Incredible.
That's just where we are in March right now. So getting back to getting the listeners ready for the NCAA tournament. What first round matchups are you most looking forward to, and why? Personally, I'm really excited about the rematch between Richmond and Duke that we've talked about at great length. Rematch of a season opening game. Richmond lost by 30, and Aaron Roussel talked about the fact that he felt good going into that game, and it kind of stopped him in his tracks every time he felt good later on in the season, thinking back to that Duke game. So excited to see how both of those teams have grown and changed. I'm also really excited about Princeton and West Virginia. I think that'll be an interesting matchup as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are, like you said, a ton of matchups. And I think this gets back to what I was saying before, especially with how the committee addressed the injuries, especially with how they sort of set up some of these storylines for us. There are just a lot of really interesting games, and not just ones on, like the really close seed lines. I mean, UNC and Sparta as sort of styles make fights. Bama and FSU, I think, again, is one of these matchups that, it's just two very different teams that each are, sort of surprised. I don't want to say surprisingly good, because they've taken, I would say, very divergent paths to get here, given that FSU ranked preseason, dropped off pretty quickly, I think, at around New Year's. Bama sort of the opposite, a bit of a surprise that they were as good as they were this year. But still, a very interesting sort of matchup of styles. And then I think lower down the seed line, like you mentioned, IU Fairfield. Obviously, I think that's the one that stands out for a lot of people, given Fairfield's record. And Drake against CU Boulder, Colorado, is going to be, I think, a surprisingly interesting one for what we know about CU. And also, people don't watch a lot of Drake. I don't blame them. Missouri Valley Conference isn't the most obvious mid-major to watch, but I think that might surprise people.
And coming up next, we'll look ahead to see who has the easiest and maybe most difficult path to the Final Four, individuals and teams we're excited to watch, and more. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. Prize Picks even offers injury insurance so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player projection won't count against you, and the rest of your entry stays live. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. One thing I'm really loving on PrizePicks right now is Demons and Goblins. It's the newest and most exciting way to play a PrizePicks. Squares with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So going back to some of our more broad predictions or what we're excited to see, what double-digit seeds do you think have the potential to make a run?
I'm not sure, with this being women's basketball, obviously I'm not sure that any teams necessarily usually lend themselves that low to going on runs. The farthest we've seen like quote unquote low ranked teams go is, when we had like Syracuse and Washington both make the Final Four back in, I think, 2016. But, they were both like 6 seeds. So I'm not sure that there is really ever sort of that potential here. I think if you're looking at teams that could, be interesting in that sense, Vanderbilt is always sort of a weird matchup for teams, especially given Baylor tends to crap the bed when they really shouldn't. They're going against a Virginia Tech team that suddenly looks extremely beatable. I think you also get this at Fairfield, if things match up properly. In terms of trying to find there, like I said before, Drake, you mentioned Richmond. These are all, I think, sort of very interesting teams that, possibly underseeded, but definitely potentially just sort of prone to giving weird upset vibes.
Weird upset vibes would be my ideal tournament setup, I think. We typically get a little chaotic when we record together, and we both love some chaos. Looking ahead, what team has the easiest and hardest path to the Final Four?
Right. So, just sticking to the, main favorites, like obviously Presbyterian has the hardest path to the Final Four because they are not a good team and they have to play South Carolina immediately. But, in terms of like actual, real main contenders, I would say the hardest path, honestly, probably might go to Iowa. Not because, they've necessarily lined up a murderer's row. They don't have to play both of UCLA or LSU, probably just one of them. But the issue for them specifically, I think, is that the committee ended up giving to the Albany 2 region a bunch of teams that I think present really tricky matchups to Iowa. No, I'm not sure that Princeton is necessarily someone prone to give Iowa big trouble. Princeton and West Virginia, I think, as you mentioned, it's a really interesting first-round game. If West Virginia wins that game, West Virginia, I think, among all the teams that are, non-favorites, they present a really tricky matchup, given how they do their press defense, given how good they are at specifically guard defense. JJ Quinterly is one of the best in the country. Given what they can do there, I think that actually presents a really tricky matchup because they want to play the way that Iowa wants to play, and they're very comfortable making things really ugly in that sense, just with their press defense. If they get past them, they're probably playing Kansas State. Iowa's played Kansas State twice this season already. They lost one of those games. The other one, I think they won by only 3 points. And then after that, you got to play UCLA or LSU, which both of whom I think are, just in terms of talent on paper, top 5 teams in the country. So if you're going off that, I understand why someone would pick Iowa to go to the Final Four. I understand why I would pick them. Why they should be the favorite coming out of that bracket. That being said, it's definitely trickier in actuality than I think it looks on paper. Sort of on the flip side of that, you got South Carolina, who has to play possibly the worst team at the tournament. That's Presbyterian. From there, you go to either Michigan State or UNC. We saw them play UNC before. Michigan State is what it is. From there, you run into IU, OU, or Fairfield. Then you run into Ole Miss, who they've already played twice. Maybe they run into Oregon State, who probably can't do anything against them because they just want to play through Reagan Beers, and that's just a limited version of what South Carolina does already. It is sort of the sort of inverse of Iowa, where it's, there are no teams specifically, I think, who present very tricky challenges there. If they run into Notre Dame, again, we saw what Notre Dame looked like in the ACC tournament. They are really banged up. They've had to play an entire season with basically a 7-person rotation, and most of them can't really score that well. It's tricky. I think in a similar sense, you get USC. It's hard to see USC not having sort of a control their own destiny vibes for me, because again, there are not terribly tricky matchups coming for them on this side of the bracket. You get either Baylor or Virginia Tech, neither of whom are particularly, I think, well equipped to deal with Juju Watkins, and both of those teams at present probably want to score, or their easiest scoring opportunities come through. It's kind of hard to score against Ryan Marshall. I think the only team really equipped to deal with them from sort of the, hey, we can manage Juju Watkins and sort of pick apart around that, it's probably Duke down at the 7-seed line, because Duke is basically a team built out of wing defenders, and, well, Juju Watkins is the best wing scorer in the country. Unless I think a USC Duke matchup would be surprisingly interesting, but besides that, again, there's no particularly strong matchups for as good as UConn is.
And what teams are you most excited to watch in the next couple of weeks?
I think it varies a little bit, right? So obviously, I'm a Duke homer, and I've had so much fun watching that team this year, especially the defense. For as much as the turnovers kill me, I think it is just really fun to be able to watch that team and how successful they are after, having covered them and not be a little less successful is basically how I'd put it. And I think there are some super fun matchups. You go from Richmond to OSU to UConn to USC, in all likelihood. And I think, coming out of those are all really compelling matchups for, again, a team that defends almost as good as any I've seen at the college level before. I'm always excited to watch NC State. It's just such a fun collection of players. Obviously, just getting to watch, I think, all the weird matchups in the Albany 1 bracket, too. So, what is Ole Miss going to do? Ole Miss Notre Dame is going to be maybe the sickos game at the tournament. Can they get to Ole Miss? That'll be fun. Or not Ole Miss. Can they get to South Carolina?
So what individual players are you most excited to watch? For me, it's Alyssa Peely and Paige Beckers, and then some Ivy League transfers and Juju Watkins at USC. I've seen Alyssa Peely and Paige Beckers in person. Always fun to watch. Haven't seen USC in person, but just really excited to get to watch them play more basketball. It's not something I've been able to catch a lot of over here on the East Coast.
So I mentioned her before, but I'll start off with, as long as I was calling my shot on Iowa, we'll go with the player I think who's situated to do this with, who I mentioned before, JJ Quinterly, West Virginia. She is one of the best bucket-getting 2 guards in the country. She is basically impossible to guard. Baylor, who has, I think, as many options for guarding sort of wings as anyone in the country other than Duke, threw 5 different defenders at her at a game about a month ago, and none of them could stop her. She scored, I think, 30 points to lead a big comeback. We don't have to talk about what happened in the final minute of that game. And she's also one of, if not the best guard defender or sort of straight up guard defender in the country. I think her versus Caitlin Clark is an incredibly compelling matchup. Just to plug another the next contributor, much like Alex Simon recently wrote about when Steph Curry in college was locked up by Antoine Wiggins. Alex wrote a whole story about how he got locked up by the guy who was actually a cousin of a current teammate, and they didn't know that until Alex approached them. But that is, I think, a really compelling matchup from that side. Pretty much everyone from LSU. How's Michaela Williams' foot feeling? How much dog in her does Angel Reese have? How much are we going to get like yelling in that game against UCLA? I'm so excited for that matchup. Hopefully that comes in. Flau'jae Johnson, I mean, has been on such a heater the past couple months for LSU. It's so much fun. And finally, Diamond Johnson playing against a good team this year. No offense to Howard, but she was healthy for one game against not healthy. She was legally allowed to play for Norfolk State against one Power 5 team this year. And now she gets Stanford. I'm super excited for that first round matchup.
And, I think we have a lot more to talk about in our next segment where we'll get into bracket strategies, more predictions, more things we're excited to watch. Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So, do you have any favorites to win a national championship and make a deep run in March? Or do you just kind of have a large group and you'll just see who battles it out, especially in that Albany 2 region?
It's pretty hard, but I'm still going with South Carolina over the field. Honestly, I mean, I've watched them play long enough. This is one of the best teams we've had in recent years in women's college basketball, despite how close it got against LSU and Tennessee. I think those are games you look back on and say, well, those were our growing pains. They dominated them in the regular season, and this is the challenge. I think, again, there just aren't that many compelling matchups for them in terms of teams I think that are built to give them a challenge. As far as other ones, why not USC? Why not UCLA? I think as far as just picking the bracket when it comes to it, for me, it's always just vibes. Vibes are always the good way to go. There's always random matchups that, go one way, that go the other when it comes to this time of year. I think I never paid too much attention to gambling, but I think like Vegas has a much lower success rate. Or not Vegas. Her Hoop Stats, I think, has a lower success rate on like pregame previews than during the regular season, but don't quote me on that. I realize I'm saying this on a recorded podcast. I'm automatically quoted on this, so this is a bad strategy on my end. But yeah, I mean, there are trends you want to go with. For example, South Carolina tends to win national tournaments this time of year. UConn tends to not miss the like Elite Eight very often. Kim Mulkey has never made back-to-back Final Fours. Is this the year it ends? Probably not. That's how historical trends work. They keep being trends until they're not. That's about how I'd put it.
Yeah. In terms of my bracket, if there's any procrastinators out there, I highly recommend the vibes and this would be fun to see. That's what I went with. So we'll see how that compares to when I've spent far too much time debating things like who's going to win the 8-9 games. So we'll just have to see how it all shakes out. What's one or two predictions you have for this tournament?
Two predictions. So given that I already gave the Mulkey isn't going to finally getting back-to-back tournaments, yeah, I'll call my shot from earlier. Iowa's not getting out of Albany. It's probably the first one I'd give it, just because I think I've already set that up and I didn't prepare for this question well enough. And the other one is probably, we're going to get some other like super weird upsets. We're not a 13 seed. We're going to get like a double-digit seed going to the Sweet 16. We're going to get like some 7 or 8 seed going to the Elite 8. It's going to be weird. They're probably going to get crushed, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I want some weird, some chaos. I think that's what makes March special and exciting to watch. Closing us out, what are you most excited for overall? Upsets, a specific vibe, something else?
I think going back to, the first thing I talked about, what I'm most excited for is just how well the committee set up this bracket, where you get so much just randomly compelling matchups in this game. So Nebraska, Texas A&M, it's the same matchup on the men's side. It's also Nebraska A&M in the first round. And for those of you who may not know, after some very tough, I guess, very tough allegations about the treatment of Ashley Scoggins back at Nebraska. That is the context for Amy Williams, who just got a very long extension at Nebraska to be their head coach. Probably not the most ethical or moral choice that they could have made in that decision. But within the context of that, their AD then went to Texas A&M about a week ago and accepted that position. So their AD is leaving Nebraska to go to A&M, the matchup that is in the first round of both tournaments. So shout out to the committees for that one. And again, just given, the random styles make fights. UNC, Michigan State, West Virginia, Iowa. What Kansas State on that side of the bracket is super interesting against either West Virginia. They are a super chaotic matchup that's already played twice this season. Or we get Iowa, Kansas State, hopefully. UCLA, LSU, I think down the bracket there. Whatever comes of the sort of Notre Dame end of the bracket between them, Ole Miss, Oregon State, South Carolina, that's a bunch of teams that sort of play similarly in terms of the level of defense. And I think that could end up being some very deranged final scores. And then just across everything else, like I said, it's setting itself up really, really well for some really interesting games against teams that we don't see play each other very often.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. As I said earlier, I'm looking forward to some upsets, a little bit of chaos. That's just who I am as a person. Thank you for joining me today, Em. Where can the listeners find you online?
Of course. So the listeners can find me on Blue Sky at Emily.Adler. They can find me, I'm trying to remember how the calendar works. They can find me Saturday, podcasting with Lincoln Schaefer and Hunter Cruz, the other members of our draft scouting team, where every Saturday we're doing our podcast. This weekend, we are doing either an episode on Georgia Amore and the sort of fringe guards in this draft class, or we're going to talk about the international players. We still haven't decided yet as of recording. And then they can also find me at, of course, thenexthoops.com, currently writing about the league's deal with Second Spectrum and how that got done about and how league personnel are, planning on implementing that. They can look forward to an extraordinarily long and detailed draft board coming out just after the national championship, and a couple weeks after that they should be blessed with our post-draft board as well, which will be sort of basically a prospect list of the best players remaining in women's college basketball.
You always have so much going on, and listeners, make sure you tune in Saturday to figure out what our draft experts will be talking about. Always learn so much from them, so either way I know it's going to be great. Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow to hear more from Em and the rest of our draft crew.